honoured to have the first ever New South Wales Agriculture Commissioner with us today, Daryl Quinlivan. He was appointed back in August, so has started getting his feet under the desk, and being a brand new role, it's one no doubt he can make his own. But officially, his job is to advocate on behalf of the state's farmers and help the sector thrive. Daryl spent several years leading the Federal Department of Agriculture, so he has plenty of experience at a senior level working with both agribusiness and politicians. Daryl, welcome. Thanks for joining us to give us a rundown on this new position. Over to you.
Thanks, Karen. I thought this is a new and policy experiment for the New South Wales government, so I thought I might begin talking a little bit about the role and then what we've been doing, although it's not a great time for establishing public profile for new roles and offices at present. We've been pretty busy behind the scenes, and some of the work we've been doing will be getting public exposure quite soon, I hope. I was approached just before August this year to test my interest in this appointment, and as Karen said, I was Secretary of the Department of Agriculture federally for just less than 5 years, finishing up earlier this year. And at that time, in fact, throughout that period, I've really been excited by the growth opportunities in the agriculture sector. And so this is a great opportunity to continue to work on those growth opportunities. But there are a lot of problems. There's no doubt the last few years have shown us in pretty graphic way that there's a lot of things to be done to realise those growth opportunities. But if we get them right, not only will the agriculture sector be larger and richer for it, but all the rural communities that are dependent on agriculture will be, and that'll be a wonderful thing for the country. So when the Minister asked me about my interest in August, I was very keen in accepting the role. It's not a statutory role. There are no powers associated with the Commissioner's position. If you like, I guess the best way of characterising the role is providing policy advice to the New South Wales government through the Minister and the Department. And the task that he's given me initially is to look at the interaction of the New South Wales planning system and agriculture, and provide some advice on how we can use the planning system more purposefully to advance agriculture. And of course, that's a centrepiece of the right to farm policy that the New South Wales government adopted at the last election and has been implementing since then. So I've had two main tasks really so far. The first one is to review implementation of the right to farm policy as it was announced at that election. And as many of you would know, New South Wales government's passed legislation to strengthen trespass laws and also to remove opportunities for people to take nuisance actions against their neighbours who are conducting lawful and compliant activities. And so those things have been legislated, and there's a raft of other things in that policy statement. And so we've been testing progress on those, and I think it's fair to say they've either been implemented or are in the process of being implemented, or they will be picked up in the next phase of the work that I'll be leading for the Minister. So we then moved on to the bigger issues really, which is how do we use the planning system to grow agriculture in New South Wales? How do we manage in a better way the existing issues? And there's a lot of them. There is a growing problem with land use conflict, particularly in the Sydney Basin and along the coastal zone, but more generally. And one of the first things we found was that this is not a New South Wales problem, and it's not an Australian problem. All wealthy countries really, in fact all countries probably, but certainly the wealthy countries around the world are all doing something in this space to try and provide for better coexistence of production agriculture and other land uses, particularly residential land uses. And where that's not happening, the the conflict is increasing and getting more difficult to manage. And I think a lot of people would say that that's a fair description of the current situation in parts of the Sydney Basin and on the north coast of New South Wales, which are two hotspots in New South Wales. So we've been looking at the planning system, changes that might be made, to the role of the regulators, particularly local government, opportunities for more effective dispute resolution, better ways of anticipating conflict and tweaking the system to reduce that potential conflict. None of these problems are novel, as I said, but the circumstances in New South Wales are a bit different to elsewhere, and so we've got to adapt it to New South Wales law and New South Wales practice, and we've been looking closely at that over the last couple of months. I'm expecting quite soon that the Minister will release our report on the implementation of the right to farm policy, and also a consultation paper which looks at these issues in more detail. And we're hoping that we'll be able to commence a consultation process before Christmas and run it through till sometime in February. And we're testing not so much the problems now. We feel like we've got a reasonable diagnosis of the problems, but we're testing now solutions to those problems. And after a few months consulting on those potential solutions and negotiations with all the interested parties, and the three key players really are the operators in the agriculture sector, and then the two regulatory bodies, the Department of Planning and local government. And local government play a really crucial role here, and I'll probably say a bit more on that later in the session. And then I'm expecting that'll then be the basis of a package that Adam Marshall will take to the New South Wales Cabinet around the middle of next year. And I've become, having worked on a lot of different things federally, I've come to understand that the planning system in New South Wales is quite like the national tax system. It's huge in its reach. It's immensely complex. Everything that you do in it matters economically and socially, and it's grown over a long time. In New South Wales case, we've been making planning decisions for well over a century. The system has evolved over that time, and basically it's a good system, but there are parts of it, as always, that are under a fair bit of stress. And this issue of production agriculture and other land uses and the tension between them is really one of the hotspots at present. And I think all parties agree on that. So I'm hoping that with even modest changes agreed by the New South Wales government through 2021, it'll yield big long-term benefits, not just for the agriculture sector, but also for the shape of our cities. We do have, I think, to make some pretty fundamental decisions soon about whether we're going to retain production agriculture and green spaces in our urban areas, because if we don't make that conscious decision and plan for it in a more assertive way, pretty much from now on, we're going to lose that land, and our cities will sprawl and be the poorer for it forever after. It's a bit of a once and forever situation, really. So we're hoping to get good feedback from all the interested parties and have compelling propositions for the New South Wales government, which I think will be to the benefit of everybody if we can get them right. So that's probably enough by way of introduction. So I'm happy to go to questions. I've got a few other things I wanted to talk about, Karen, but if we don't pick them up in questions, I'll pick them up anyway.
For sure. No, that's great, Daryl. Thank you. It gives us a good overview of the role. Now, don't forget, if you're watching and you have questions, don't keep them to yourself. Use the Q&A function to ask them, and then we'll get Daryl onto those. So, Daryl, you mentioned this right to farm policy that the state government's put in place. What does that term mean from your perspective?
Well, a lot of people are very keen on the language because it's so strong and strident, and I can understand that. But it is capable of being misunderstood because it doesn't really create new rights. Some people feel quite threatened by the idea of creating new rights, nor does it impair existing rights. So it's a more benign thing than it may sound, but the central principle behind it, I think, is a very good and strong one, and that is that people who have businesses that are operating in a compliant way under the law and under established practice should be able to conduct their business operations in a way that is not hindered by unreasonable pressures from outside, whether they be community or political campaigns or whatever. So that's the first principle. And then the second principle behind it is that if businesses are able to practice their operations in an unhindered way, they'll feel more confident about investing in those businesses, and so will others involved in those businesses. And investment is the critical thing for growth in agriculture and rural jobs in New South Wales. So they're the two principles underlying it. There's a whole lot of detail, obviously, but they're the two principles. They're really important. They're correct. And so we're going to find as many ways as we can to implement those principles through policy, law and practice in New South Wales. A lot of them won't be called right to farm. A lot of them will be called things like increasing the capacity of local government authorities to manage their regulatory responsibilities, which might sound like a dry issue and one that is at the polar opposite end of something like a right to farm. But actually, it's the most crucial thing in many ways, because local government is the crucial regulator for most of the land use decisions involving agriculture. And there's a big spectrum of capacities and interests in local government authorities, some doing it very well, some really struggling. A lot of them would like a lot of help from the state government to do their jobs better. And so that's one of the things that we're really hoping we can do through this process. And if we can, I think that'll be a really important contribution to regional economic development.
I know there's been a lot of pressure from farmers about wanting to keep doing what they've always done, and as you say, they're legitimate businesses. Are there areas that you think where there does need to be a bit of give and take from the farmer's perspective? Do they need to listen to their neighbours in some areas and the rest of the community and actually change their practices?
Well, all of this is a double-edged sword, of course. The same farmer who has wanted to practice their operations unhindered for most of their career might be the very person who wants to subdivide their land later in their career to realise increased capital values. So that's an issue. And then there's also, as always in communities of practice, there's 90+% of people who do absolutely the right thing and strive to do the right thing, and a small number who don't, who then create a problem for everybody else by creating reputational issues and so on. And that's why industries create their own codes of practice. And in some cases, I think we'll find over time that those industry-created codes of practice will become a shield to protect operators who do the right thing, and governments might need to put a bit of force of law behind those codes of practice to effectively protect and reward people who are operating in a responsible way, but also to create an incentive for those who aren't to improve their performance. But on the other side of the ledger, there's clearly, I think we'd all have to acknowledge that over time, there has been a growing divide between urban and rural communities in their understanding of what agriculture actually means. And so we know that, for instance, that a majority of complaints to local government about farmers practicing their agriculture are actually complaints about compliant practices, and in many cases they're complaints about practices that would be in any definition best practice in the industry. And an obvious example of that, one that people talk about a lot, is picking up broiler chickens in the middle of the night, because that's the time from an animal welfare point of view that's clearly best to doing that. And if you're operating a dairy, you need to turn the lights on and start working at 4:30 in the morning or whenever your day begins, and that's not really a discretionary thing. That's absolutely necessary, and urban communities understand that less than they used to, and so they're less tolerant of it than they used to be. And so I think there's a job for governments, for local government authorities that have agriculture being practiced in their jurisdiction, and for the farming groups themselves to do a bit more to educate urban dwellers and neighbours and so on about good practices. And some countries, and we'll talk about this in the documents when they're released, there are some countries that have actually tried to codify all that and provide some strong regulatory support for the operation of normal or acceptable agriculture practices, so that not only is it clear what the governments are agreeing is good practice, but they're protecting it from complaints, vexatious or well-intentioned. So yeah, there's clearly a lot to do in that area.
Yes, and it's interesting that a lot of the time that agriculture is there first, and it's one of the things that drew people to live in a rural lifestyle, and then the complaints start. So it's not an easy task, as you say.
No, and in a way, that's the central problem, because I was going to say since Federation, but probably all the way back since we started practicing agriculture 10,000 years ago, agriculture has been a bit of a residual land use, in the sense that land has been typically used first for agriculture, and then other land uses have commenced, and they've taken over that land, and agriculture's receded away from urban areas and so on. And that's all very well up to a point, but as I was saying earlier, if we want to have green spaces and production areas in close to our cities, and I think if you ask a majority of people, in principle at least, they're going to say absolutely we do. That's going to add to the quality of our cities and the long-term quality of our lives. But if we want that, we need to find a way of protecting that land use and finding ways for those land uses to coexist in a more peaceful and cooperative way. And we're not really doing that at present. I think that it does require policy change. Anyway, that's clearly on Adam Marshall's mind. That's one of the jobs he's given me, and I know from speaking to previous planning ministers in New South Wales and elsewhere, lots of people have thought, yeah, that is a really important issue and a big problem. Maybe I'll leave that for my successor. So I'm hoping with Adam and his colleagues in New South Wales, we'll have better luck this time. Yeah.
Fair enough. Now, we've had a question come in from the land. You mentioned just then this whole urban and other uses for land, but also water. So there's a lot of talk about the Murray-Darling Basin and how agriculture uses water in the system. Is that sort of issue part of your brief as well? And how would you like to see that resolved, that complex environment and community and farming sort of an issue there?
Well, at present, I'm really only looking at the planning aspects of that. So clearly we have a finite amount of water for use in Land Australia, and our experience over the last 20 years has shown us that 3 or 4 times over that period that water supply has been placed under extreme stress by rainfall, but protracted periods of low rainfall. So that's going to continue to be the pattern into the future, I think. we still use 100-year averages and things like that for some of our planning decisions. But I think the more relevant experience for thinking about the future is actually the most recent past, the last 20 years, and we've seen the system under extreme stress. So we've got a finite amount of water. What's not so finite is the amount of capital that we have to apply to that water use. And so I think that's the more likely, that is the pathway for development of agriculture in Australia. Most of the growth is going to come through more capital investment, more intensive production systems, many of which are very water efficient, protected horticulture and so on. We're going to see less grain exported, more of it transformed into meat products domestically. So there's a lot of changes that you can see are going to happen over the next decade or so, most of them designed one way or another to get more value out of our natural resource base, including our water supply. So the Murray-Darling water reform program is well advanced. I think we have recovered about 75, might even be up to 80% now of the targeted amount of water. The last 20% is going to be the most difficult amount, and we've got through till 2024 and beyond to finish the program. And I think it's important we keep going, because if we don't, we'll have to come back and start again at some point. And there's a lot of trouble for sure, a lot of difficulties, but also good momentum and goodwill towards water reform. And in the end, the water users in the agriculture sector will be one of the greater beneficiaries of all this, because there will be greater water security at the end of it. There's no doubt about that. And that'll be important for the kind of investments that will be necessary to get more economic value from all of that water as it's deployed. So there's no doubt we're going to see less water used for broadacre pasture growth and so on, and that'll be because there are higher value uses, and that's just part of economic development, whether it be in rural Australia or anywhere else. So I don't think we should be scared of that. When things settle, the investment and some of the politics is a bit less sharp. I think the environment for new investment in some of these areas will be much more positive, and there's no doubt there are a lot of people wanting to invest in agriculture at present. And so that's one of the reasons why I think the future is so bright. But yeah, we do have a lot of problems to solve, and that's one of them, but there's a lot of others as well.
Yeah, so slightly related but wider than the Murray-Darling Basin, we've come off one of the worst droughts in living memory. What have we learnt, do you think? And are we heading towards resilience, or have we just gone straight back to square one as soon as it rains?
Well, I think the last drought really has been very instructive for us about how much progress we have made over the last 20 years, because on many measures, the most recent drought was the most significant one in some areas in recorded history, in others for a very long time. But commercially, from a farming point of view, it wasn't nearly so bad as the Millennium Drought. If you recall, in the Millennium Drought, people took too long to make decisions on destocking, and then when they did, it all happened at once. Livestock values crashed, land values fell or stalled pretty much across the country, and there was both the climate-induced trauma, but also commercial trauma, and it took a long time for people to recover from that. The experience this time was very different. People made early and well-informed decisions about the operations of their farming businesses. We've now got, compared to 20 years ago, a globally diverse set of markets which were able to take up all of the sell-off in livestock that occurred as a result of the drought, in a way that maintained prices at a historically high level all the way through the drought. So people, even those who sold all of their livestock, they had good bank balances at the end of it. which was a source of investment when the time came to restock. We've got mechanisms like farm management deposits and others that allow people to manage the variability from year to year better. And so we've come out of this drought. We're always going to have droughts in Australia, and we're expecting that they'll probably be, more severe and so on in the future. But from a commercial point of view and from a policy point of view, I think we're much better set up now than we've ever been, really. And the most recent drought and the experience of not every farmer, I mean, obviously it was more serious in some areas and people made mistakes, but I think the experience this time was light years better than previous droughts. And so that's an indication of how much progress we've made, how much we've learned, how much better at running their businesses farmers have become, which is just fantastic, really, looking forward. So, yeah, I think that's another reason to be positive about the future, because it just showed how well we can cope with a drought like that because of what we've learned and the quality of the decisions that people are making now.
Yeah. We've had a question come in from Nick Savage that you mentioned the use of the planning system to advance agriculture and that you're looking to changes to local government as part of your role. In the recent koala SEP, it was apparent that it was a local government versus agriculture that's currently managed under the laws that govern land management, the LLS Act and BCA. Question, in your examination of the changes that are needed to local government, is the increasing capacity you're looking at going to intrude back into agriculture, where the tension showed local government is a threat to farmers' use of their land, i.e. KPOMs, creating E-zones?
Look, I'm not going to say much about koalas because it's not in my, it's not part of my my work. But I will say this: that the vast majority of farmers who have important ecological assets on their properties, including koalas and wetlands and so on, treasure those assets and go to great lengths to look after them. So it's been a great pity the way the debate about koalas has been portrayed publicly, because I think it's really misrepresented the interests and feelings of farmers generally who don't really want to have anything to do with damaging koala habitat or the long-term viability of koala populations. They want to do quite the reverse. But in those areas where they're making significant making significant decisions that disadvantage their businesses, I think they're entitled to compensation for looking after these things in the broader community interest. And so I think there's a lot of scope for governments to think about how they do that. But the idea that farmers generally are interested in clearing land at the expense of koalas, I think, is a ridiculous proposition and hasn't been true for a very, very long time of the farming community generally. So that's the first thing to say. I think it's a great pity the way the issue has been portrayed publicly. On local government, I think local government generally needs more confidence as a regulator. They need to be more confident in making decisions that might see them exposed in the courts. At present, they're very resistant to making decisions that might see them in the courts. And they're looking generally, I think, for better guidance from the New South Wales government into how to do how to play their role and how to make more capable and confident decisions. And in doing so, I think that'll improve both the investment climate, but also give people more confidence about the long-term maintenance of those ecological assets in the rural landscape. So I think there's a win-win there. The question was next question was going a little bit to the interests of some local governments, which are either not too well disposed to agriculture, or unwilling to make decisions that strike the hard balance that I've been talking about here. And I think they're they're the very cases where people are saying to us the state government should really, one way or another, and some of it can be through law, some of it can be through policy guidance, but one way or another, it would be a very good thing if the state government provided those local government regulators with a bit more guidance in how to carry out their obligations.
Yeah. You mentioned before the way the conversation has revolved around things like koalas. So as a Farm Riders Association, we obviously have a lot of rural journalists as part of our cohort. Is there a message to them then, and also I guess to the metro media, on how they can play a role on what you're doing and those sorts of issues that you're dealing with?
Well, yes, I hope so. And when I agreed to do this now, I had anticipated we'd have some of these consultation documents out, and I was hoping to take you through them and ask for your help in stimulating a public discussion about some of these things as timing has worked out, partly koala related. That hasn't happened, but we're not too far away. So when they are released, I'd love to spend time with any of you individually or collectively going through those issues and getting your help in stimulating a public discussion about these things, because they're both important and very complicated, and there are lots of different points of view, and some of the simplistic things that people have thought about to solve problems in this area either will never be accepted, or if they are, won't work as effectively as people might think. So we've got to work our way through the complexity. And I mentioned earlier that the New South Wales planning system is a bit like the Titanic or the Commonwealth tax system. You don't make dramatic changes to it, in quick time without running the risk of unintended consequences. So got to go about this in a thoughtful way, and we'll need as much help as we can get when we're doing that. So I'd be happy to spend as much time with any of you as you would like to have when they're released, and I'm freely available to talk to you about those issues then. Hopefully it'll only be another week or two away.
Sounds fantastic, Daryl. So how important is something like agricultural representation then in shaping the direction that your role takes, the industry, and how that's going? I mean, the publicity when you started was talking about you being an advocate for farmers. How do you know what farmers want? How do you decide what the important issues are, or what the right solution as far as farmers is?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of farm representative bodies at both the statewide level and the industry level, and I've met with most of those who have a material interest in land use planning issues, and in particular those issues of conflict about land use or operations or production operations at present. The berry industry is a good example on the New South Wales coast. So we've spent quite a bit of time talking to those groups, shaping up our agenda over the last few months, and we'll keep doing that. They're a crucial source of advice and information, and in particular evidence, because one of the things we've really struggled with, and this will come up, I'm sure, when our package goes to Cabinet soon, and the Premier will say, well, what's your evidence here? And the answer is, well, there isn't actually a lot of evidence. It's very hard to collect evidence on things that don't happen, investments that went to Queensland or Victoria rather than New South Wales because there was a more sympathetic regulatory environment, or investments that didn't happen because people found the planning system just too hard to get up expansion to their existing operations, or a new operation on existing or adjacent land. And then there is very poor reporting really on land use conflict and its resolution, or not at a local government level. So the evidence is pretty poor. So we are very reliant on the industry groups bringing that evidence to us, anecdotal, quantitative, in whatever form we can get. So yeah, we'll continue working with those groups.
Yeah. And we have a question from New South Wales farmers, from Matthew Madden. Would you endorse policies that encourage better knowledge of grain stocks within Australia to better mitigate the need for grain imports?
I don't think so. I think it's a really slippery slope, and Australia's our rural prosperity and our agriculture sector is entirely dependent on trade, and we can see that at present just how vulnerable some aspects of that trade are with the disruption of our exports to China. But that's true globally. Those export markets are very fragile and easily disrupted. And if we start imposing trade-related, if we start imposing policies that affect our competitiveness and our position and our reputation as a reliable supplier of high quality food products globally, I think that will be very much to our long-term cost. And yes, I can see how last year you might have said it was a good idea to impose those restrictions. But in the end, it all worked out. We transported, I don't know how many million tonnes it was in the end, of grain from Western Australia to the East Coast. It worked out, and the very limited imports that did occur were done under the most strictly controlled conditions you can imagine, and were very, very expensive to the extent where it was very clear to everybody involved in that, I think, that it was not a normal commercial decision and not one that was ever likely to happen on a bigger scale. It would only happen in the most extreme of circumstances. So I think, again, reflecting on your question about droughts, the experience there was that we didn't rush to hasty judgments. People found their way around it, and we're all better off, I think, for having done that rather than made hasty interventions that might have had long-term costs and unintended consequences.
Yeah. And you mentioned before with the drought that you do think that Australian farmers have come a long way and are doing an amazing job. What are some of the things that you most admire about Australian farmers and the way they do business?
Well, we have the most variable climate on Earth. Excuse me, I've just had a postman at the front door, I think.
The dog's decided to join in.
Yeah. We have the most variable climate on Earth, and but farmers have, for 100 years now, have been coping with that and adapting to that. In some cases, experiencing extreme trauma, but they learn all the time. And the last 20 years, the progress we've made in managing through droughts has been extraordinary. But also what we've learned in meeting the needs of our customers offshore has been extraordinary. So 20 years ago, we were happy to send our livestock to the market and our plant products to the wholesale markets, and they went where they went. Now people take an intense interest in those consumer markets at the end, and they do all they can to meet the needs of those consumer markets. And that's why we've got such a fantastic reputation internationally for our food products. So, I think the progress we've made in the last 20 years, the improved practices, the knowledge, just attuning people to end markets, the change has been astronomical, and very much to the credit of Australian farmers.
Do you think the family farm has a strong future? And what is it that what you're doing, how do you think that may support both diversity and ownership, and maybe even help some young people into the industry?
I think the difficulty with this discussion is people mistake family farms for medium-sized mixed farming businesses, and they're not the same thing at all. So what we've seen demographically in Australia is a bit of a hollowing out. We've seen an increase in the scale and the number of large farm operations. Well, we've also seen an increase in the number of small farm operations, and what we've seen is a reduced number of medium-sized operations, which is what people typically think of as the family farm. But a lot of those larger farm enterprises are still owned by families and operated by families, and I think the evidence is pretty clear that family-owned farming businesses will always be the most efficient, because they're the ones where people will go that extra mile always to make their business a success and make the farm operate properly. And that's partly why a lot of those medium-sized family businesses have grown into quite large ones, because they've been very successful. So I think the evidence is clear that family farms are the most efficient. I think ABARES and others have published some pretty clear evidence on that, but not in the form in which people might traditionally have thought about them, because clearly, we're heading towards more large-scale businesses, but also more small niche businesses based on more intensive production and greater value adding. And there's room for both of those in the rural landscape.
Yeah. You have a farm yourself near Yass. Tell us a bit about that. How important is it in keeping your feet on the ground and staying connected to the real issues that are facing farmers to have that skin in the game?
Oh, well, I love it. I run merino ewes and Angus cattle, and so I watch the prices in the markets pretty carefully all the time and have a good idea about what's happening with wool prices and what the latest debate is on farm practices and animal welfare, and also, I've got the Burra River runs through my property, so I've got a very keen sense of looking after the local assets that are also owned effectively by the community, because of all the people up and down that river and the local town, which is dependent on it for its water supply. So yeah, I think I've got. It's not a large commercial farm, but it's given me a very keen insight into all of those issues, and it's a way I've got to know a lot of the local farmers who are operating large commercial enterprises, and so I've got quite good friends with a lot of those people now, which has been a huge benefit to me in all of my jobs over the last decade or so, in understanding what thinking is in rural Australia and the farming community. And the most important lesson in all that is that farming is a complex, sophisticated business. It requires knowledge, it requires careful judgment, requires research, careful observation of what's happening around you, good knowledge of markets, an ability to cooperate with neighbours, the importance of the local communities, the firefighting service and all the crucial roles all those community groups play, and that there's a diversity amongst farmers which you would never understand reading the metropolitan press. That there's a wide spectrum of farmers in what they do and what they think and how they conduct their lives, and there's the same richness in rural communities and amongst farmers as there is in any other community, including urban communities. And I think that's a really important insight a lot of people forget when they talk about farmers and rural towns and so on. They're not a uniform species.
Very true. Are there other agricultural commissioners or similar roles in other states? You mentioned that this is obviously not a New South Wales, Australian issue, it's a global issue. Do you know if there are other people in similar roles, and if so, is it something that you can learn from each other or learn from what other jurisdictions are doing?
Not really. What has tended to happen is that state governments have often created these roles to deal with a crisis. So they've created these roles to improve the flow of information in a drought, for instance. I think New South Wales had 2 drought commissioners. Bushfires is another one, recovery from bushfires. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not reacting to or trying to create a more effective pathway out of a crisis. What the job I've been given effectively is to help the New South Wales government make better policy decisions as they affect agriculture and farming communities. So in a sense, it's a bit more like a policy research body, although the minister may give me other jobs from time to time. So if you like it, perhaps a better parallel might be the Australian Farm Institute, but inside government, talking to ministers and departments inside government and influencing, hopefully, work done inside the government rather than from outside. That would be a better parallel. But I could see these kind of things happening elsewhere. Most states have, for instance, things like the Small Business Commissioner, whose job it is to do pretty much the same sort of thing for small businesses in those jurisdictions, to look at issues as they develop, contribute to internal debates, perhaps contribute to cabinet discussions on matters as they affect small business. So that's the kind of thing that I'll be doing for agriculture in New South Wales. So I can see that being a model adopted elsewhere.
Okay. And so once you solve this problem about land use clashes and things, what are the other areas that you think need to be tackled? What are some of the biggest challenges facing New South Wales agriculture in terms of helping it to grow and thrive?
Well, I can confidently say this issue will never be solved because, not least because, we do have in Australia, we do have a fast-growing population, and those people want to live in our cities and along the coastal strip, which are the very areas where land use conflict is occurring most at present. But also on the other side of the ledger, I think because of the increased profitability we've seen in agriculture since 2016, we are seeing a bit of a surge in investment and renewed interest from institutional investors in agriculture in New South Wales and elsewhere. So we're seeing agriculture pushing back a bit, perhaps in ways we wouldn't have seen 20 years ago. And so and land values are high, and so agriculture is seen as a pretty safe investment at present, I think, by a lot of investors. So I'm pretty confident we won't see the issue resolved, but if we can improve the climate for investment in agriculture in New South Wales, that will be the single most important thing we can do for the future of agriculture and rural communities. Because, as I mentioned earlier, I think wherever you look in livestock production, horticulture, pretty much across the board, it's pretty clear that the growth pathway is going to be more intensive production methods, more intensive use of the natural resource base, especially water. But increasingly also people in making those kind of investments, they want to be close to labour supply, which means close to a city or a town. They want to be close to reliable power supply, possibly gas, certainly connectivity. Reliable connectivity is crucial to these kind of businesses, and all of those things mean that people will be looking to locate those kind of investments within reasonable distance of settled areas in whatever form they may be. And so that immediately brings up the land use issues and the potential for land use conflict immediately. So I see the planning issues we're looking at as being right at the very heart of the future development pathway for agriculture in New South Wales. And so if we can make good progress in this area, I think it'll be the single most important contribution we can make. The other areas that are absolutely crucial are maintaining our access to international markets. That's absolutely essential to Australia. All of our growth in agriculture really is going to be into offshore markets, because we'll never, even with fast growth, our domestic population will never take up much more than a little bit more of our current domestic production. So the growth opportunities are all offshore, and that's where high quality product, good reliable biosecurity status and so on are absolutely crucial to maintaining that market access. And so, I'd point to effective regulation and use of chemicals, maintaining our biosecurity status, and producers continuing to strive for best practice to meet the rising expectations of those offshore consumers. They're the most important things.
Terrific. Now, Daryl, did we cover all of the things that you wanted to talk about today?
Yeah, I think so, in a roundabout way, and I'll look forward to hopefully opportunities to talk to you individually or otherwise about the more concrete ideas that we've got for implementing all the things I've talked about when those documents are released in the near future.